Anyhow, well, thank you everyone for being here today. It's good for us to be able to have the opportunity to be in the Lord's house and study His Word. So we've got a lengthy Bible study ahead of us today. Probably not going to finish it all today, and that's okay. So let's go ahead and get started with a word of prayer. Almighty God and Father, we thank you for the opportunity you give us to come together around your word and for the promise that you've given to us that you will be present wherever two or three gather in your name. And so we ask you to be present now and to fill our hearts with the comfort and the joy that comes to us from your word. Guide our hearts and minds to understand what we're reading and hearing and learning, and then be able to put it into practice in our daily lives. To you be all honor, glory, and praise, now and forevermore. Amen. Okay, so we are in, for the confirmation students, what's known as Unit 3, Section 1. That's why it says Section 1 at the top of your pages of the handout. Let's begin. Since the time when Adam and Eve sinned, God promised that He would fix the relationship with Him that they had broken. He began to keep that promise by making a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In that covenant, He promised that He would cause their descendants to multiply greatly and move to a land of their own and become a great nation. But most importantly, He also promised that one of Abraham's descendants would be the Savior of the world, who would defeat sin, death, and the devil, and bring about peace with God to mankind by fulfilling all of God's law perfectly. God made this promise to Abraham and reaffirmed it with his sons Isaac and Jacob. Well, grandson Jacob. When God reaffirmed His covenant promises with Jacob, He also changed Jacob's name to Israel. As time went on, Jacob had 12 sons. His favorite son was Joseph, because he was the son of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. Because Jacob favored Joseph, he gave Joseph lots of special gifts, including a multicolored robe, which was unique in those days. Joseph's brothers were angry with jealousy. Things got even worse when Joseph told them about a dream that he had had about them. And so we begin now by looking at Genesis 37, verses 5 to 11. Would somebody like to read that section, please? Chapter 37 from Genesis, verses 5 to 11.
Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, and his father kept the saying in mind.
Okay, thank you. All right, getting back to the handout. They were so angry, the brothers, that one day they attacked Joseph and sold him into slavery. They didn't want to kill him because he was their brother, but they didn't want him around anymore either. So staying in chapter 37, would somebody please read verses 18 to 24?
They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it.
All right. Would somebody else read verses 26 to 28, please?
Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. For he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. The Midianite traders passed by, and he drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt.
Okay, so pretty familiar story to a lot of folks. They even made a famous musical about it. So far, this is a pretty well-known story. It's unfortunate that there was such jealousy, but that's the reality of life in this world. Going back to the handout, after many years as a slave, Joseph ended up working for Potiphar, who was an important Egyptian official. Through all of his troubles, Joseph continued to trust and obey God, and God continued to bless Joseph. Therefore, whatever Joseph did, he was successful at it. His masters, including Potiphar, were pleased with his work. Potiphar was so pleased that he made Joseph his head slave, responsible for all of Potiphar's property. Let's turn to chapter 39 now, Genesis 39, verses 1 to 4.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was once Pharaoh's official, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Israelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. And he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned.
All right. So things are going well for Joseph in Potiphar's house until one day Potiphar's wife wanted to be unfaithful to her husband with Joseph. Joseph rejected her, saying, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Notice the motivating factor for Joseph was not fear of Potiphar. It was love for God. Understanding that God had blessed him so richly, how could he then in turn betray God? Potiphar's wife was so angry, however, at Joseph rejecting her, that she lied about him and tried to get him into trouble anyway, even though he hadn't done anything. So chapter 39 again, verses 19 to 23.
As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
All right, thank you. After that, Potiphar had Joseph thrown into prison where he's put in chains. Still, Joseph continued to trust God, and God continued to bless him. That's one of the wonderful things about the story of Joseph, is that no matter what unjust, unfair things happened, you never read about him feeling sorry for himself and certainly not cursing God. He continued to trust God, and God continued to bless him. Now, I wish that that was true for all of us, that when we endure unjust things, if we just continue to love God and be faithful to him, he'll reward us, and everything will be good for us. Fortunately, that's not something that God has promised to do for us. I don't even know that he promised to do it for Joseph, he just did it for Joseph. And there was a reason why he did it for Joseph. God had something that he wanted to accomplish through Joseph, and blessing him was part of the ways that God was going to accomplish that. So among the other things that happened to him, going back to the handout, while in prison, Joseph discovered that God had given him the ability to interpret the dreams of others. Joseph interpreted the dreams of 2 other slaves who were imprisoned with him. We read that story in Genesis 40, verses 8 to 23. And whoever starts does not have to finish. They can just stop and let someone else take over when they feel like it. So chapter 40, beginning at verse 8.
We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand.
So I want to take over from verse 12.
Then Joseph said to him, This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit.
Verse 16, someone, please.
When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked good or baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In the 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him.
Now, the cupbearer was so happy to be out of prison and back, amongst the ones walking around free, that he forgot about everything that Joseph had done and said. But the dreams came true, just as Joseph had said they would. One day the Pharaoh, and this is for the kids, they maybe don't know what a Pharaoh is, the king of Egypt, he came to his officials with a problem. He was having terrible dreams, but he didn't know what they meant. He asked them, the officials, to help him understand his dreams, but they couldn't. Then the chief cupbearer remembered how Joseph had interpreted his dreams correctly, so he told Pharaoh about Joseph. Pharaoh brought Joseph out from prison and told him his dreams. With God's help, Joseph was able to tell Pharaoh what his dreams meant. So let's read those dreams in chapter 41, starting with verses 17 to 21.
But Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, sorry and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that ate up first. But even after they had eaten, Abraham then wanted to tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up.
All right, thank you. And then the other dream, if somebody would read 28 to 32. Bless you.
It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by the reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Pharaoh was pleased with Joseph and made him a very important official in his court. Second in command, in fact, ruler over everything in the land except the Pharaoh himself. One of Joseph's jobs was to store food during the time of great harvests, so that when the famine hit, there would be enough food stored up for everyone. At that time, if anyone wanted food, they would have to travel to Egypt and pay Pharaoh for the food, which would make him even richer than he already was. This made Pharaoh even more happy with Joseph. Still in chapter 41, let's read 39 to 43.
Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt.
And for what it's worth, during this time, Egypt was one of the world powers, so to be second in command was a pretty high honor. All right, moving on in time, the famine, 7 years of plenty have already gone and passed, and then there's the time of famine. During the famine, Joseph's family, who were still back in Canaan, known as the Promised Land, at least later it would be known as that, they came to Egypt to get food from Pharaoh, just like everybody else. And they ended up dealing with Joseph, although they didn't recognize him at first. All right, chapter 42, verses 1 to 8.
When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him.
All right. So why do you suppose that Joseph was able to recognize his brothers, but they didn't recognize him? Yeah, he was a lot different than what they knew. Obviously, they weren't expecting to see him either. But, I mean, he's all dressed up, and if we're to believe the hieroglyphics and all that, he probably had makeup on. I don't know if that's true or not, but in the movies, it seems like all the Egyptian people that were high-ranking had makeup on. Dressed in fine clothes. Who knows what kind of shaving he had done. The brothers, on the other hand, think they had changed much over the years? Probably not. Still wearing the same old robes and having the same beards and, you know, looking like they always had.
I thought Joseph was just a child when they sold him into slavery. Maybe not young, but like 12 or 13. The person's 12 or 13, and then all of a sudden he's 30. They look a lot different.
Yeah,
Whereas if you go from 30 to 40, you don't mean.
right. And that could be another reason why they didn't recognize him, as the last they saw him was a kid. Yeah. Good point. So here's the situation. Joseph has the opportunity to just punish his brothers. They are the one that put him in a pit and had threatened to kill him and then sold him as a slave. I mean, just a horrific way of treating their brother. Now he gets to have his revenge. Does he do it? Well, let's see. When Joseph told them who he was, they were afraid. Now, we've skipped over a lot of stuff. Remember, this is for our confirmation students, and a lot of things transpired between the time that he sees them the first time and the time that he sees them again later and tells them who he is. So we're skipping over all of that part. If you want to look at what happened, you obviously can read about that in chapters 43 and 44, but we're skipping ahead to chapter 45 now. When Joseph told them who he was, much later, they were afraid because of what he had done, what they had done to him when he was young. Well, let's see what happened at that encounter. Genesis 45, verses 1 to 11.
When Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, he cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence.
All right, I'm going to pause there for a second. Joseph's reaction when he finally is able to, I mean, he's been kind of yanking their chain a little bit and not letting them know who he was. He was kind of playing that on for a while. But now he finally is going to tell them. And what is his emotional state? Is he angry at them? No. No, matter of fact, he is, well, I don't know how you would describe it. Joyfully sad, perhaps, at everything that had transpired, the brokenness that existed in their relationship with him. Obviously, it's with great joy that he sees his brother, but I think there's some sadness there too, just because of all the things that have transpired. And so he tells them, is Dad still alive? You know, after everything that had happened to him, he's still Joseph, his father's son. He still wants to know how his dad is doing. The brothers couldn't answer him. They were dismayed at his presence. That's probably not maybe the best interpretation of that, because when we think of dismayed, there's like mostly sadness. You know, you get up in the morning and the weather forecast said it was going to be a sunny and warm day, and there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. You're dismayed. You were hoping for something different. I don't think that the brothers were necessarily hoping for something different. I'm not sure that they were completely sad. I think what they were was troubled, maybe fearfully troubled, that they now know who this person is, that it's their brother. I'm sure there's great fear in that news, because he hasn't told them what he's going to do to them yet, as a result of the fact that he's their brother. So I'm sure that they're a bit troubled and nervous and fearful, but I don't think that they're dismayed in the sense that we think of dismayed. It's probably more fearful. Moving on, if Steve wants to keep going, he can. If anybody else wants to take over, they can do that too.
So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord to all his house, and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me. And you and your children and your children's children, your flocks and your herds and all you have. There I will provide for you, and there you will get 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty.
Okay, thank you. Lots of stuff lots to unpack there. The first thing that Joseph wants them to know is that this was ultimately God at work. I'm very hesitant to use the word God's plan, because whenever we hear that, we get some very unbiblical thoughts. You know, bad things happen and it was part of God's plan. That's usually just not the case. But we do know that God works good in all things for those who love him. So even when bad things happen, God can make good come out of it. But in this particular case, there's enough references where I'm comfortable saying God seems to have been at work in all of this. I'm not saying that God caused the brothers to sin against Joseph by doing what they did, but God knew that it was going to happen. Obviously, he's God, and he had a way of making it work for good. And so Joseph recognizes that as well. You know, that don't beat yourself up over this, because God was able to make this work for good, to preserve life. If we're going to play the what-if machine, what if none of this happens? Joseph doesn't get sold into slavery, doesn't end up in Egypt. What happens when there's 7 years of prosperity?
People die.
Prosperity. In other words, the harvests were huge. Everybody had lots of food, lots of wealth. What would happen during those 7 years? Not what comes afterwards. We know what comes next. But just during those 7 years, would they be storing it up and being very careful to measure out their wealth?
No.
No. They'd spend it. What do most people do if they suddenly win the lottery? Let's say a medium-sized lottery, not hundreds of millions. But if you win $10,000 in a scratch-off game, do you think to yourself, I'm going to put this away, and I'm not going to spend any of it because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I want to have this little rainy day fund set up.
I don't have much left after taxes.
Well,
Here's your $5. Good job.
after taxes, you're right, there may not quite be much to do with, but anyway, so a medium-sized amount of money. Aren't you going to treat yourself a little bit? Maybe if you're wise with your money, you'll put some aside, but most people would find a way to spend it. If Joseph's not around to tell them what's coming next, they're going to be fat and sassy and happy, and they're not going to be storing up food because they don't know the famine's coming. So when the famine comes, what's going to happen? Emma? When the famine comes,
They're going to die.
lots of people are going to die because there isn't any food saved up. They didn't know that it was coming, and they're going to starve. I mean, if it's a famine where they're not even bothering to plow for 7 years, there's literally no food coming in. How would our world do if we had 7 years of no food production? We only had to live off what had been produced before.
You starve.
It'd be tough. A lot of people would starve, wouldn't they? Yeah.
Well, it's just-
But God sent Joseph ahead of time
it's just like
so
in
that
the
this could be stored up. Hazel?
This is like in the 80s when the farm economy tanked. People had overspent, they had overborrowed. When the years were good.
Yeah.
And then they were totally unprepared for that, for a disaster that hit that particular part of the economy.
Yep. Yep. And that's why it was so important that somebody knew it was coming. If we knew the housing bubble was going to crash, the farming economy was going to crash as it did, or whatever other economic catastrophes might come, if we knew that those things were coming, we could prepare for them. And that's what God enabled the world to do through Joseph, to prepare for the fact that a famine was coming. And this was how God worked good in evil to preserve life, as it said in verse 5. Moving on in the text, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth. You know, that's the other thing to keep in mind. we've talked about this in previous Bible studies, this idea of remnant theology. That out of many, God is going to choose one through whom he'll keep his promise. You know, it started, first of all, probably with Noah and his family. Out of their children, God promised to bring a remnant about. And then obviously through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, through them, a remnant would continue to be preserved because a Savior was going to come from out of them. If all of the children of Israel died, I guess the future Savior could come through Joseph, but the rest of the children of Israel would be gone. So that's the remnant that needs to be preserved in order for God's promises to be fulfilled, and God preserves them. As he often does, God acts not only out of affection, but out of faithfulness. He made a promise, he's going to keep it. He promised these things to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's going to keep his promise and preserve their children as a remnant out of whom the Savior will come. So again, Joseph says, this is God who did all this. So don't beat yourself up over this. God wanted this to happen. He caused it to happen to save many lives and fulfill many promises. Then he says, now, go get Dad and the rest of the family and come on down to Egypt because this is where all the food is. And so now they're up in Israel, that general land we'll call the Promised Land, and he invites them to come down to Goshen. I don't know if you're familiar with the layout of Egypt, but you've got the Nile River flowing from the north to the south. And, well, I don't know, I take it back. I don't know what direction it flows. But it runs north-south, the Nile River does, and at the top is the delta, where it splits off into all kinds of kind of smaller streams. That land is very fertile because of all the water. That's Goshen. And so Joseph was inviting his family to come to the best land at that time, maybe in the whole world, at least the known world, because even despite the famine, that land was probably still going to be good and useful for something. So that's what he invites them to do, is come down to Goshen. And he says, I'll provide for you. Despite everything that you've done to me, I will provide for you. In many ways, Joseph should remind us of a New Testament figure who was mistreated very terribly, but forgives the ones who mistreated him and actually provides for them and saves them. Jesus, yeah, it's the Sunday school answer. Jesus. Yeah, so when we look at Joseph, in many ways, we see kind of a foreshadowing of what Christ would do for us. But of course, Christ is much greater, obviously, than Joseph, but it's just sort of a small foreshadowing of the greatness of Christ to come. And so when we look at Joseph and see what he's willing to do for his brothers, we can take heart because Christ did that for us. Despite everything we had done, he forgave us and welcomed us into his promised land. All right, moving on, bottom of page 2. Joseph forgave his brothers and invited the whole family to move to Egypt, where he could provide them with all the food they could ever need and other blessings too. This story is another example of how God works good in all things for the good of those who love him. As Joseph noted, God used the evil of Joseph's brothers to save the world from famine, especially the children of Israel, even though they did not deserve it. So the children of Israel packed up their stuff and moved to Egypt. That's how the book of Genesis ends. So if we turn to chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis, let's read verses 18 to 21.
His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them.
All right, thank you. Am I in the place of God? What does that mean? When they all give every indication that they're afraid of Joseph, he reassures them by saying, am I in the place of God? What did he mean by that?
He wasn't there to judge them.
Right. Yeah, I'm not here to judge you. That's not my job. You know, my job is to love you and take care of you as God has called me to do. God will judge you, but not me. And he forgave, you know, his brothers. And again, reiterated that what they meant for evil, God used for good, which is something that we should take comfort in all the time, that even in the evil things we experience in this world, God can work good. There was some part of this that we skipped over, but it's really, as a side note, kind of interesting. Joseph tells his brothers that someday they're going to go up out of this land of Egypt and go back to the land of their home. And he says, when that happens, make sure you take my bones with you when you go. It's just a little side note, a little nugget that you can just tuck away, because that kind of comes up a little bit later in an interesting way. So anyway, so then at the end of Genesis, Joseph dies, and all of the children of Israel have now come down to Egypt. And that's how the book of Exodus begins. Moving on, the book of Exodus begins with the descendants of Israel already living in Egypt. Although they came to Egypt with only 70 family members, after 400 years had passed, the children of Israel, now called Israelites, had grown into a very large number. There were so many of them that when a new Pharaoh came into power, he was afraid of them. This new Pharaoh was from a different line of kings and did not know or trust the relationship and peace that the Israelites had had with the previous pharaohs. At one time I knew the names of the pharaohs. I have forgotten them, and in my I was doing this last night. I just didn't take the time to look it up, but Tutankhamun was one of them. I don't know if he was the outgoing or the incoming. I think the incoming, but most people know King Tut, you know, from the family of the Tutankhamons. I think that was the one who took over at this time. Excuse me, but I can't say that for sure. I don't remember. Anyway, but that's the situation. The previous line of kings had a relationship with the Israelites and trusted them, because I'm sure that passed down through the centuries, there was, you know, from the Pharaoh's side of things, these are our allies, these are our friends, and they were treated like that. But then a new king comes in and takes over who has none of that family line and none of that heritage and history, and so they immediately view the Israelites suspiciously. We've seen this before in Genesis, when Isaac was getting so prosperous that people just didn't trust him. He had so many kids, which are soldiers in that time, and so much wealth that if he wanted to make war on anybody, he could have, and probably pretty successfully. So people were scared of him. And we see the same thing is true of the Israelites, that now the new Pharaoh is afraid of them because they have the power, if they want to use it, to give Egypt a kind of a run for their money. So let's turn to Exodus chapter 1 and read about that in verses 6 to 14.
Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves.
All right, thank you. I misspoke. It wasn't Isaac, it was Jacob, the one that was blessed so richly that people were scared of him. And the same thing was true of Jacob. The more that people tried to take advantage of him, including Laban, his uncle, the more he ended up blessed. And that's the same thing going on here for the Israelites in Egypt. The more that they were oppressed by the Egyptians, the more they grew, which is interesting. It's probably totally unrelated, but we see that in the history of the church in the New Testament, it's during times of persecution that it grew strongest. It's only during times of ease and comfort that the church gets weak. And so I don't know if there's any connection at all, but it's just worth noting that no matter what the Egyptians tried to do, none of it could weaken the people of God. So they put them to work. They enslaved them, basically, and made them build these store cities, these places for storing up grain and whatnot. And they were ruthless about it. So we all know the story of the Ten Commandments and Charlton Heston and all of that. So let's move on with the handout here. The new Pharaoh decided to limit their numbers by making the Israelites into slaves. When that didn't work, Pharaoh ordered all the newborn boys to be killed. But God was watching over his people, and he worked through faithful women to save many of the boys that Pharaoh tried to kill. Do you guys know that story of the midwives? They didn't have obstetricians and all that. I mean, they had women whose specialty was helping deliver babies. They're called midwives. And so when the time came for the Israelite women to give birth, the midwives were there. Pharaoh commanded them, when you deliver these babies, because they're on the receiving end, so to speak, take them and kill them. And the midwives said, no, we will not. That was a mandate that God's people, specifically these faithful women, were not going to comply with. Whatever the cost might be to them, they said, we're not going to do this. This isn't right. And so they made up some stories a little bit to cover themselves and said, oh, these wives, boy, they are tough. These mothers giving birth, they are tough. We just couldn't get those babies away from them. When in reality, they just said, no, we're not going to do that. And so we give thanks to God for those faithful women who had the courage to do what was right. And through them, God saved many of the children that Pharaoh tried to kill. One of the boys that God saved was named Moses. God saved him by having his mother put him in a floating basket and send him down the river. Along the way, Moses' sister Miriam kept watch over the basket until it was safely found by someone. And someone did find it, Pharaoh's daughter. She took him in and raised him as her own child, a prince in Pharaoh's court. And we can read that in chapter 2, verses 5 to 9.
Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him.
I don't know if it's irony, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it's interesting anyway, that Moses' mother sends the baby down the river to save the baby's life, and in the end, she gets the baby back, at least for a while, to nurse Moses and raise him and nourish him, and she even gets paid to do it. So God was working through these things to bless her and her family. As Moses grew up, he came to discover that he was an Israelite, not an Egyptian. So one day when he saw an Egyptian guard whipping an Israelite slave, Moses killed the guard. And we see that in Exodus 2, verses 11 to 15.
One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian eating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why did you strike your companion? He answered, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well.
All right, thank you. How many of you have seen that movie, The Ten Commandments, with Charlton Heston, that old? Maybe half? You guys didn't really raise your hands very high. I wasn't asking for volunteers for anything. I'm asking only because, for me, I think I saw that movie before I ever read the book of Exodus. So every time I read Exodus, it's always with the wrong viewpoint that the movie was right, and then the Bible is telling us basically the script of the movie. And there are a number of different places where the movie and the scriptures diverge and maybe disagree. One of them is in Moses' knowledge of his own identity. In the movie, it seems like he never knew until word got out later when he was an adult. And I always thought it was interesting that the scriptures don't indicate that at all. They seem to indicate he always knew he was a Hebrew. Now, maybe for the purposes of making movies, that doesn't make sense, because why would he allow himself to be in a position of power and authority over his fellow Israelites while they're enslaved and he's a prince? I don't know. I don't think the scriptures ever address that. But they do seem to indicate that he always knew he was a Hebrew. He was an Israelite. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out, because if you learned the book of Exodus like I did from the movie, that's one of the points that you often will make that mistake on, is that somehow he didn't know. He always knew, and however he dealt with that, we see here that he did defend one of his Hebrew brethren, and it led to him actually getting chased out of Egypt. All right, after that, Moses had to flee Egypt. After a long time of wandering, he came to the land of Midian. That's where he met Jethro, who was a priest. Moses stayed with Jethro and worked for him as a shepherd. He also married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah. One day, while Moses was tending sheep, God appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush and spoke to him. He told Moses to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 10 tells us that story.
Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Pharaoh, the mountain of God.
All right, I want to stop you right there for a second. Horeb. And many people think Horeb was another name for Sinai. So this mountain that he's on, Horeb, is the mountain that eventually God leads him back to, where he gives him the Ten Commandments and all that other stuff. So it's not uncommon for places to have multiple names. And so just have that understanding as you go through this. This is possibly, maybe, probably Mount Sinai. All right, go ahead.
And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
All right, I want to stop there for a second again. The place you're standing is holy ground. What made the ground holy?
God's presence.
Yeah, God was there. The presence of God is what made it holy, and that's why church is a holy place. God's presence is there. That's why me and the acolytes bow before we go up towards the altar area, because it's holy space. Now, God's presence isn't there like it was, in the episode of the burning bush, or perhaps in the temple when God dwelt in the Holy of Holies. But we recognize the holiness of God, and we honor that when we approach the Lord's table and his altar in that way, because it is holy ground. Now, moving on. Verse 7.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites.
Yeah, good. I'll give you a break after going through all of those names. In other words, this is a land that's really, really good, but it also happens to be inhabited by other peoples. In some cases, powerful peoples. And God says, I'm going to bring you into that land, and I'm going to give that land that currently belongs to these other people to you. All right, verse 9.
And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring me people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt.
Okay, thank you. I will bring my people, the children of Israel. Among the other times, here's another time where God indicates he has a special relationship with Israel. And it's because of the covenant promises that he made to them. They are special to him because he chose to make them special to him. And one of the things that I want you to remember as we continue to go through the Old Testament is we are the children of Israel. The New Testament children of Israel. We are, as Jesus says in John chapter 8, I think, we're the descendants of Abraham. Not by blood, but by faith. Abraham believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. When we believe God's promises, we are Abraham's spiritual descendants and the true Israel, the true children of God by faith. So we're probably going to end with that today, but it always at least makes me feel good to think that God is calling me one of his children, and I am one of his people, the children of New Testament Israel. So I guess that's a good way to send you out today, is go forth knowing that you are the people of God, you are his children, and he has a very special relationship with you through Christ. Thanks for being here today. Guess we'll see you again next week.